and most appropriately for what I'm investigating, the great architect of the universe. I discovered a long-distance alignment that leads from France to the United Kingdom. This one begins very close to Chartres, both in time and space. Chartres Cathedral was built at the same time as Bourges Cathedral, and is only 100 miles away. When I was studying Bourges Cathedral, I kept thinking about the connections between the founder of the Gothic style and the Templars. So I drew a line in Google Earth from the central entry of Bourges Cathedral to the entry of Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. So what? You can draw a line between any 2 points, but you won't believe what the line passes directly over in London, the headquarters of the United Grand Freemasonic Lodge of England. The United Grand Lodge of England is the main governing body of Freemasonry within England, Wales, and much of the former British Empire. The building is on Great Queen Street, no less. UGLY, as the organization is known, seems to be a fitting acronym for its Ugly as Sin container, historically third on the site since Masonic meetings first started here in 1775, a year before the American Revolution. Perhaps some of America's Masonic founding fathers planned the revolution here. I'm not sure. When the Templars were around, they controlled a sizable district less than half a mile away in the city of London. The temple includes Temple Church, the adjacent middle and outer temples, and a host of related buildings. The Templars themselves said they designed the round portion of Temple Church after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which also features a rotunda. Perhaps politics motivated them to claim Christian provenance for their temple. Longtime esoteric researcher John Smout says a better geometric comparison is between Temple Church and the Dome of the Rock, which seems to have a high degree of correlation with the round church's ground plan. This makes more sense to me, as the Templars did take their name from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Case in point, they were never known as the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. Whichever building was ultimately their template, the Templar influence was so powerful that they actually got the Patriarch of Jerusalem to come to London and consecrate Temple Church in 1185. Temple Church was brought to the public's attention in the Da Vinci Code, where it was the scene of a shootout amidst marble effigies of medieval knights. The temple served at times as the residence of kings and representatives of the Pope, while Temple Church itself served as a depository bank. I believe Smout's geometric analysis of Temple Church is right on the money, if you'll pardon the pun. The temple plan is laid out with triangles and squares, which we know from studying Chartres Cathedral have hidden significance. Triangles and squares are arranged in such a way as to depict 3 cubes. The symbolism of 3 cubes is something we've seen before in the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. I believe 3 cubes symbolize the holographic nature of the universe, the human, planetary, and stellar scales resonating as a fractal structure, as above, so below. My reasons for coming to this unusual conclusion will become apparent in the Paris episodes. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, Sir Christopher Wren was chosen to redesign St. Paul's Cathedral. He oriented St. Paul's in line with the axis of Temple Church. Extending beyond St. Paul's, we see the alignment continues to the Bank of England. The bank was chartered in 1694 during the construction of Wren's Cathedral. More than just a local branch, the Bank of England is the central bank of the whole of the United Kingdom, and is the model on which most countries' modern central banks are based. The Bank of England is literally the mother of all banks. Recall how the Templars' meteoric rise in power came in part by becoming the first transnational bank, and how Temple Church itself acted as a bank, whilst housing both royals and papal representatives. By tracing the alignment from Temple Church to the Bank of England through St. Paul's Cathedral, we draw a connection between Templars, the modern banking system, and the Church, 3 powerful bedfellows. The Bank of England presides over a street pyramid in the heart of the City of London. The symbolism of the bank over a pyramid suggests a hidden power relationship, analogous to the House of the Temple presiding over the Pyramid of Washington, D.C. After all, pyramids are clear symbols of hierarchy, and one can read it as control from the top down. The base of the pyramid contains the London Stone, said to be the rock from which all distances in the United Kingdom were measured. The Romans laid this foundation stone in London, just as they had done earlier with the Umbilicus Urbis Romae. You could say this pyramid was built on a rock-solid Roman foundation. Some of the greatest secrets are hidden in plain sight. Isn't that strange? I mean, if you ran a secret society, why painstakingly encrypt your greatest truths in alignments, city plans, and in architecture? I would have thought there were better ways of keeping secrets. There must be some kind of power gained or maintained by hiding these truths out in the open where many can see, but few understand. Sir Christopher Wren was a brilliant mathematician, astronomer, geometer, and architect. He was an enlightened man who clearly excelled in the 7 liberal arts. St. Paul's Cathedral is the most important building of Wren's architectural career. Stephen Skinner pointed out in his book Sacred Geometry that the length of St. Paul's, including its entrance steps, measures 555 feet, and that this distance is equal to the height of the Washington Monument. Recall how triple sixes and fives are encoded in this singular measure, as 6,660 inches equals 555 feet. St. Paul's length therefore symbolizes the relationship between macrocosm and microcosm. The distance from the floor of the cathedral to the top of the cross on its dome is 365 feet, matching the height and symbolism of the sun tower at Chartres. St. Paul's is one of the few places we're not surprised to see the English foot used as the unit of measure. Trying to decipher London from another angle, I was looking at Buckingham Palace and wondering about the perfectly straight axis called the Mall in front of it. Wanting to trace where this obvious gesture leads, I need to ask, where does the royal axis go? It appears that the Mall leads to the Admiralty Arch, but then the axis seems to fade away in the confusion of buildings along the Strand. Or does it? Tracing the axis beginning at Buckingham Palace, passing over the Victoria Memorial, traveling along the Mall, going under the Admiralty Arch and through the buildings on the Strand, the axis arrives precisely at Temple Bar. Temple Bar was a gate designed by Sir Christopher Wren to ceremonially bar access to the City of London. It got the name Temple from being directly in front of the Templar compound. The temple was taken over by the Inns of Court after the Templars were ousted in 1307. The Middle Temple and Outer Temple are 2 of the Inns of Court to which all barristers in England must today belong. In fact, the phrase the bar, meaning the legal profession as a whole, can be traced back to Temple Bar. Wren's Gate is no longer there, but tradition and the law remain. Traditionally, the Lord Mayor would offer the sword of state to the Queen when she passed through the gate as a token of loyalty. It is a little-known legal fact that the monarch may not enter the City of London without the permission of the Lord Mayor of London. What's up with that? I always thought the Queen was the one in charge. You might be surprised to learn that the Lord Mayor is not the Mayor of London, nor is the City of London the same as Greater London. Confused? The law can do that. The person the Queen bows to is the Lord Mayor of London. He's the guy who runs the City of London Corporation, a tiny private jurisdiction that covers only about 1 square mile. The wealthiest square mile on earth, as it's often referred to, is the sovereign state within Greater London, whose boundary closely follows the ancient Roman walls of Londinium. In Isaac Newton's day, there were more than 200,000 souls living within the square mile, but now that figure is down to less than 10,000. Today, the tiny city of London has become a leading center of global finance. Other powerful sovereign cities within cities that come to mind are of course the United Nations headquarters and Vatican City. Let's see if you can guess the final city in my world tour. Here we are over a semi-public urban park. I was drawn to this place when I read it had a small Egyptian pyramid folly, 9 gates, and a 5th-generation watchman who lives in the diminutive rotunda building right here. 5 generations of watchmen living in a tiny pavilion must be motivated to guard something pretty interesting. The informal layout and curving walkways say English Garden, but having been immersed in London, something bigger popped out at me: the shape of the park. It closely matches the ancient walls of the City of London. This park was built by the richest man in the country, who was also a king's cousin. He was a lover of all things English, an enemy of all things royalist. He ended up being beheaded like so many others of his time. Where are we? If you guessed Paris, you're correct. We entered the City of Light through the portal of Parc Monceau, established by Louis-Philippe II, Duc d'Orléans. As you may have guessed, the Duke of Orleans was a Freemason. He actually served as Grand Master of the governing body of French Freemasonry, the Grand Orient of France. The pyramid in Parc Monceau is trivial, however, compared to what the Louvre pyramid encodes. President François Mitterrand commissioned the Louvre pyramid and the adjacent pyramid in Versailles to be completed by 1989 for the celebration of the bicentennial of the French Revolution. Mitterrand personally selected architect I.M. Pei without hosting a design competition, as would be expected for such an important commission. The modern pyramid's metal armature was designed to support a lot of glass. Wikipedia states that the official brochure published during construction cited 666 as its number of panes, but then writes it off as an urban legend because in actual fact the pyramid contains a different number of panes. That didn't stop various journalists at the time from drumming up quite a controversy about the number of the beast, and Mitterrand was jokingly referred to as the Sun King for a while. However, I have indeed found 666 rhombi symbolized in the pyramid. Why rhombi, you ask? A rhombus can be made from 2 conjoined equilateral triangles. The rhombus is the masculine or linear element inside the feminine curves of the Vesica Pisces, whose name means vessel of the fish, because the Christian fish symbol emerges from it. The rhombus is therefore a sacred symbol. Notice how each of the larger rhombic frames contains 36 rhombic panes of glass. As you can see, the number of rhombic panes on a typical face adds up to 153. This is a very interesting number that has mystical Christian significance. Do you remember the square root of 153 being equal to the number of moons in a year? We learned that fact by studying Stonehenge. Here's a quote from the New Testament that entangles fish and 153 in a Christian net. Simon Peter went up, and drew the net to land full of great fishes, 153, and for all there were so many, yet was not the net broken. This number of fish, why bother enumerating them, has puzzled scholars for centuries, and is an example of how parables in the Bible encrypt important information in plain text. Here's Jesus describing his practice of hiding information in symbols. He answered and said unto them, Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. Tabulating the additional triangles and converting them to rhombi, and then adding the number of rhombic frames, we get 166.5 symbolic rhombi in a typical face, and 4 such faces equals 666. Let's look at the actual Bible quote and see what it tells us in regard to the infamous number of the beast. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Why man is called a beast should be obvious by what humans are doing to this planet's natural environment. We may be bestial in our unenlightened state, but this is beside the point I'm making. The beast here is not Satan, but man. In particular, the Louvre pyramid is about a man. Robert Bauval had a stunning realization described in the book Talisman. He realized the historic core of Paris is correlated with the temples of Luxor and Karnak in Egypt. Luxor and Karnak are adjacent ancient temples. Bauval observed that the 6-degree angle between the axes of Luxor and Karnak matched the 6-degree bend in the Louvre. The Temple of Luxor is the one with the embedded 6-degree angle. I went a step further and laid the Luxor ground plan over the Louvre and the Tuileries garden. The Tuileries was laid out by Le Notre at the request of Louis XIV. We see this direct correlation only when the temple plan is mirrored. Might the Sun King's intention have been for Paris to be the mirror of Luxor? Validation that the Temple of Luxor was used as a design template is the fact that the obelisk erected in the Place de la Concorde is from the very same Temple of Luxor. After the Revolution, the Luxor obelisk replaced the guillotine in what became known as the Place de la Concorde. In an outstanding act of engineering, the obelisk was erected by the aforementioned Duke of Orleans' son, who many years after the 1789 Revolution became the last king of France. The important thing to recognize here is that the French obsession with Hermetic symbolism passed through the Revolution completely unscathed. In the early 20th century, modern French alchemist Schwaller de Lubix lived in Luxor for 15 years. Out of his intensive study came the book The Temple of Man, wherein he showed how the Temple of Luxor represents the body of a man. Now we're really on to something. I see the head here, the neck, the heart, all the way to the small chambers of the intestines here. The obelisk is, of course, his erect phallus. The ancient Egyptians related the cult of the phallus with the dismemberment of Osiris. Next, I overlaid the most famous depiction of the human body ever made, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. See how his leg follows the bend in the Seine? These roads follow the angle of his other leg, and the Luxembourg Gardens seem to parallel his arm. Could the Vitruvian Man be another hidden template in the design of Paris? If so, I suspect the man of Paris is Osiris. Thinking on this, I started to see energy centers in the parterres of the Tuileries. At first I thought they were chakras, but their locations tell a slightly different story. In a normal state of consciousness, people don't see chakras. However, as we learned at Chartres, chakras are part of the architecture of the universe we've been investigating. If chakras exist on another level of reality, call it the etheric body or aura if you will, then their interface in our everyday reality is controlled by the endocrine system in the physical body. Why do we care? Because stimulating and balancing the endocrine system can lead to states of ecstasy, using more of the brain, slowing the aging process, attaining enlightenment, and even experiencing everlasting life, as some believe. I was able to pinpoint gland locations in Paris because of another observation. Many famous public spaces have axial streets pointing directly to where the ductless glands would be in the body of a man. The Church of the Madeleine and Palais Bourbon form a cross-axis directly in line with the obelisk in La Place de la Concorde. On one side we have Napoleon's church venerating Mary Magdalene, who is said to have started the royal bloodline of the Son of God. On the other side is the Palais Bourbon, containing the lower house of the Parliament of France, known as the National Assembly. These two Roman-styled temples energize the gonads in the body of Paris, on either side of his phallus centered on the axe historique. The gland most associated with enlightened states is of course the pineal, which actually looks like a tiny pine cone in the center of the human brain. This colossal pine cone is in the courtyard of the Belvedere in the Vatican, a name which recalls the affluent town of the same name overlooking San Francisco. The pine cone is flanked by two peacocks, which are ancient symbols of resurrection that predate Christianity. Believe it or not, there is an empty black coffin I couldn't get a picture of behind the colossal pine cone that symbolizes the death and rebirth of Osiris. The pine cone in the private courtyard is actually a 1st century bronze that used to act as a fountain in front of the Temple of Isis in ancient Rome. In the Renaissance, Sixtus V built the library wing that closed off the courtyard, perhaps in order to hide pagan symbols not easily explained by the Catholic Church. The pineal gland of Paris marks one endpoint of a line starting at the Paris Observatory, whose construction was incidentally authorized by Louis XIV. This axis passes directly through the French Senate and the Luxembourg Gardens. This cosmic connection to enlightenment is not lost on me. Also notable is the fact that nothing aligns with the thymus or throat chakra. As the throat is associated with speaking and communication, it seems appropriate nothing should energize this center if secrecy is to be maintained. Each of the other alignments is an interesting case study for further analysis. Parc Monceau is right under the Vitruvian man's foot. His outstretched leg seems to point directly at the rotunda building where the gatekeeper lives. The tiny rotunda was designed by architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux, an interesting figure to be sure. Ledoux built 63 toll barrier buildings in the city wall built around Paris in the Ancien Regime to collect taxes. This tax wall was universally hated and was torn down during the Revolution. When the Paris metro was built, it made sense to dig up the city where the extra space for the wall had been, so metro lines 2 and 6 follow the tax wall boundary. Only 3 of Ledoux's tax structures remain today, and the rotunda in Parc Monceau is one of them. I submit that it's no accident that precisely these Ledoux buildings were left intact. We already know about the rotunda, but what is the significance of these other 2 Ledoux buildings? They're all about solar alignment. The red line pointing to the Rotunda de la Villette in Place Stalingrad precisely marks the azimuth of summer solstice sunrise. Look at how this water channel continues the alignment. Some other examples of this alignment we've seen before are the line connecting the Vatican obelisk with the obelisk in Piazza del Popolo, and in the orientation of Chartres Cathedral. The green line pointing to the Barrière d'Enfer, or Gate of Hell, is oriented appropriately due south. It's called the Gate of Hell because Ledoux's pair of tax collection buildings are immediately adjacent to the entrance of the Paris catacombs. This reminds me of the phrase, "Nothing is as sure as death and taxes." The yellow line points to the Trocadero in the azimuth of equinoctial sunset. Trocadero marks the beginning of the white axis running through the Eiffel Tower and the École Militaire complex. The white line connects Trocadero to the Gate of Hell, but has no astronomical meaning as far as I can tell. The blue line starts at the obelisk at Place Fontenoy, which is right on the white axis in front of UNESCO. This non-Egyptian obelisk commemorates a battle that took place in the year 841, but the obelisk was erected here in 1860. The blue line is precisely the azimuth of winter solstice sunset. Maybe you're wondering where all the colored lines converge. Their common center is precisely at the entrance to the Tuileries garden. But why is it there? Before the Revolution, the Tuileries was a royal palace that closed off the Louvre courtyard. The center point of the solar alignments lies directly in front of the entrance to the royal palace. The palace was destroyed in the chaos of the Revolution, but the alignments remain. Just like the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Louvre Pyramid will yield more secrets upon further analysis. The plan of the Louvre Pyramid and the fountains surrounding it is itself a sacred diagram. Referred to as the sacred cut of Ad Quadratum, the diagram was traditionally used as an astrological house chart in centuries past. Overlaid is the house chart Johannes Kepler made for General Wallenstein in 1608. Yes, that's the same Kepler who discovered the 3 laws of planetary motion that keep telecommunication satellites in orbit today. Astrology is actually very serious business. The Louvre Pyramid acts as entrance to the world's most visited museum. Recall how I overlaid the Vitruvian Man only after analyzing the pyramid itself and finding the mark of the beast encoded within. The Vitruvian man's mouth corresponds appropriately with this entrance, so the next time you enter the Louvre, ponder its symbolism. You are entering the mouth of the beast. Look at what is aligned with this so-called mouth, the Palais Royal. Central to French history, the Palais Royal is where many generations of royals lived. Louis XIV grew up there, for example. The Duke of Orleans later owned the palace. I was extremely surprised to recognize the 5x12 Jerusalem rectangle precisely framed in the proportions of the royal palace's court of honor. The palace garden's two famous lawns symbolize the two holiest spots in Christianity and Judaism. There is clearly a royal French connection to the ancient mysteries. Royal of royals, Louis XIV's reign of 72 years was longer and arguably more powerful than any other king in European history. Architect of the Vatican's St. Peter's Square, Gian Lorenzo Bernini allegorically portrayed Louis XIV as Alexander the Great in the famous equestrian statue located in front of the Louvre Pyramid. This statue marks the beginning and faces in the direction of what is called the Axe Historique of Paris. The historical axis runs from the equestrian statue of Louis XIV, under Napoleon's Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel, through the Tuileries, over the Luxor obelisk, under the Arc de Triomphe, all the way along the Champs-Élysées to its endpoint within the Grand Arch in La Défense. French Egyptologist Jean-Marcel Humbert had this to say about the Axe Historique. I have not verified this, but it is said that the Great Axis is a Masonic alignment, and that this is not the result of chance. It is known that the Freemasons find their origins in ancient Egypt. I have verified that the Axe Historique is indeed aligned to the heliacal rising of Sirius, just as is the older Notre Dame on the Ile de la Cité, whose axis parallels the Champs-Élysées. Hancock and Beval trace the origins of this alignment to the fact that Notre Dame was likely built over an ancient Roman temple of Isis. Notre Dame, or Our Lady, is therefore Mary veiling Isis. Perhaps even more amazing, Hancock and Beval show the word Paris comes from the melding together of the words Pharia Isis. Pharia, or Pharos in Greek, is the island where the wondrous lighthouse of Alexandria was, and the center of Isis worship in antiquity. Now let's imagine taking an enlightening ride with the Sun King along the axis he laid out, which was greatly embellished with hidden symbolism by Napoleon, Mitterrand, and many others on up to the present day. For the first destination, we must travel underground, both under the Earth's surface and below public consciousness. La Pyramide Inversée is an underground atrium space surrounded by fashionable boutiques. The downward-facing pyramid is the symbolic opposite to the famous museum entrance. As the upward-pointing pyramid symbolizes a man, the inverted pyramid must therefore represent a woman. In alchemy, the symbols for fire and water are upward and downward-facing triangles. This polarity is also represented in Western mysticism as sword and chalice. The chalice in question is, of course, the Holy Grail. Going with the Holy Blood, Holy Grail thesis, it's fitting that Dan Brown chose to portray the location of the tomb of Mary Magdalene right here, under the Pyramide Inversée, at the end of the Da Vinci Code. If the Star of David is the symbol of the union of male and female, then the star tetrahedron is its 3D equivalent. Drunvalo Melchizedek's volumes on the ancient secret of the flower of life show the human energy field, or Merkaba as it's known, takes the form of a star tetrahedron, male and female being inversions of each other. On a higher level, Richard Hoagland has shown how star tetrahedron geometry is implicated in hyperdimensional energy outflows coming from planetary cores in our solar system. When a star tetrahedron is inscribed within a sphere, its points touch the sphere's surface at 19.5 degrees north and south latitude. On Earth, one of the tetrahedral points is on the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii, which is actually the largest mountain on Earth if measured from the seafloor. Similar energy outflows occur at 19.5 degrees north or south on Mars' Olympus Mons, which is the largest mountain in the solar system, in Jupiter's Great Red Spot, and Neptune's Great Dark Spot. Explaining these outflows requires a four-dimensional model of physics, where energy is gated from the Sun to the planetary cores through hyperspace. Energy transduced by each planetary body appears to us as heat in 3D, emerging from the most stable of all three-dimensional forms, the star tetrahedron. The simplest way of describing a physics that's based on the same geometry for both planetary and human energy fields would be, as above, so below, the Hermetic motto.